If we are going to respect limits to global warming, we have to shut down fossil fuel production virtually in its entirety and as fast as physically possible. A lot of the carbon dioxide removal technologies really have the status of magic because these technologies do not exist in reality for the most part. To bank on them marks a break with reality, a kind of detachment from the material world, which has been ongoing in climate politics for some time.
Andreas, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you.
I want to start with some very fun news from today. The Copernicus Agency from the EU published that the past 12 months we've been 1.6 degrees Celsius on average above pre-industrial levels, which, if you're someone who's familiar with the goals of the Paris Agreement, sort of 1.5 degree threshold, sounds pretty bad. Sounds pretty bad in general. But in your latest book called Overshoot, one of the things that you unpack is that actually, in a way, this has kind of always been the plan. So could you just talk to us about what Overshoot is and kind of how it came to be like politically accepted as the default position on climate?
So the idea of Overshoot is basically that you can set a limit to global warming, and you can respect that limit by exceeding it and then returning to it. And this kind of counterintuitive idea emerged out of a predicament, which was that once limits to global warming had been specified, 2 degrees and then 1.5, it became clear that to actually respect these limits, as in not going beyond them, actually capping warming at these levels, you would need very swift emissions reductions. And you would need to destroy a lot of capital sunk into fossil fuel infrastructure. These investments would not be able to live out their expected lifetime and yield their profits to their owners. And modelers who plotted trajectories for climate policy just couldn't find a way to imagine that these limits could, in the real world, be respected in the common sense way of, if you put a limit to something, you don't go beyond it. So instead they came up with the idea that we can reach 1.5 degrees, for instance, by first going far beyond it. Exactly how far is unclear, or was could be imagined in different ways, and emit more CO2, because presumably we couldn't stop ourselves from doing this. And then towards the end of the century, suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere and go back to 1.5 by means of negative emissions technologies. And the key technology for achieving this was, by the time this idea came into circulation, a non-existent technology. This is bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So the what we call in the book programmatic overshoot is this notion that we can overshoot a temperature limit and then return to it later. Then we also speak about overshoot in slightly different with slightly different meanings, but this is the idea in these models and in climate science and policy following roughly the time of the Paris Agreement.
And it's interesting because, you know, for a long time, the target was much more staunchly 2 degrees Celsius. So in a way, kind of establishing 1.5 degrees felt like, to the casual observer, we are taking a more radical position. Would you say that Overshoot just kind of has enabled the opposite? I mean, we've basically done nothing to mitigate fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions more broadly. How much of that comes down to this assumption that we can simply overshoot, and how much of that relates to, I guess these are related questions, but the kind of embedded power of fossil capital?
Yeah, well, so first of all, the identification of 1.5 as a target in the Paris Agreement, and it was like solidified in the years after with a special report on 1.5 that the IPCC produced in 2018. This represented a victory of sorts for the Global South and for the climate movement. And although, yes, it was and is a radical ambition, the situation that we're seeing right now on the climate front is that global warming is totally spinning out of control. And just as you said, we are now in the process of transgressing 1.5. And climate scientists are persistently dumbstruck by the speed of this process, because climate science, this is something that Women I write quite extensively about in the sequel to this book. Climate science has long had an ingrained bias towards gradualism, expecting that climate change will proceed slowly, incrementally, gradually. And because of this bias, it has underestimated the speed with which global warming is developing. So, what is radical, what is extreme or not? Well, the warming is extremely fast right now, and the disasters are striking at a quick pace. Just the other day in Valencia, in the global south all the time, but that isn't so much reported about. And there's also a very rapidly developing science about the various tipping points in the climate systems and how close they are. And again, there is a process of constant revision where the key tipping points in the subsystems of the climate system, the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the AMOC, popularly associated with the Gulf Stream, the permafrost, the Amazon rainforest, are coming closer and closer to 1.5. So there's a cluster of these tipping points between 1.5 and 2 degrees. That's when the melting of the Greenland ice sheet becomes irreversible, which means 7 meters of sea level rise. Same with the West Antarctic ice sheet, same with the potential collapse of the Amazon into a savanna and the melting of the permafrost and all of this stuff. So what's really, really extreme here is not the demand of 1.5, because it really now comes across as a minimum demand for some kind of sanity and survival and maintenance of this planet in a habitable state. What's really extreme is to let this process, unfold and let warming continue between 1.5 and 2 degrees, because this is the minefield where all the bombs will go off. Not all of them. The East Antarctic ice sheet has a tipping point that is maybe around 8 degrees of warming. But virtually all the other key elements have tipping points that are located in this span. So it's an absurdly extremist idea, actually, to let the warming continue and run above 1.5, up to 2 and perhaps beyond, and have the idea that we're then going to be able to go back to this baseline or limit. Because once you've crossed these various tipping points, imagine, for instance, that the Amazon, which is a rainforest that's 60 million years old, switches to a savanna. This is a process that's already in motion in some parts of the rainforest. And the rainforest, the whole ecosystem, has suffered an unprecedented drought in the past year. And so this, the Amazon is almost perched on the tipping point of this kind of, mind-boggling collapse, that the Amazon would disappear as a rainforest and become another kind of ecosystem, a kind of, dried out savanna type of ecosystem. Once that happens, the Amazon is lost. And you can't just recreate it by having negative emissions technology sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. The same with the Greenland ice sheet. If that ice sheet is undergoing irreversible melting and you have 7 meters of sea level rise in the pipeline, there's no way to get the Greenland ice sheet reconstituted without cooling the Earth so much that you plunge it back into a new ice age, because the Greenland ice sheet is a legacy of previous ice ages, and you would need a new glaciation to recreate that ice sheet once it's lost. So my point here is that the true extremism here is not to insist on 1.5 degrees as a target, but it is to just let things continue in the hope that we can have some kind of techno fix towards the end of the century. If these tipping points are crossed, there's no going back.
I want to talk about the techno fixes a little bit in your forthcoming book, which I haven't yet had the pleasure of reading. But you talk about sort of 3 key pathways beyond mitigation, if we just sort of give that up as a goal. Not that we should, every sort of ton of CO2 matters, but, adaptation, and then sort of carbon removal technologies, which you just mentioned there, and then also sort of geoengineering, principally kind of solar radiation management.
Yeah.
And I think if, we take the premise that these things are inevitable to some degree, which I think is the argument you make, I'd be interested to know what you think the kind of left position is, particularly on geoengineering. And I'm thinking a bit about, we had an interview a few episodes back with Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction author, and in Ministry for the Future, the novel opens with, I'm not sure if you read it, but it opens with a kind of heat wave that kills millions in Uttar Pradesh in India. And as a result, the Indian government sort of unilaterally enacts solar radiation management. And I think the case that he's making there is that, if you are the government of a country, in the global south on the front line of impacts, who would we be to say that, you can't do that? And I'd just be interested to know, what we should make of that kind of argument.
So this is a big chunk of the second book that Wim and I wrote, which is going to be insanely long. It's like a
small topic, so
yeah, it's like a kind of a performative imitation of the idea of Overshoot itself. That it's become a kind of limitless book project. It just has continued and continued. But yeah, so the third part of the second book is about solar geoengineering, and Kim Stanley Robinson is probably the most prominent left-wing voice making a progressive case for geoengineering. Holly Jean Buck is another one. We argue in this part of the book that there can be no left case for geoengineering, and for many reasons. I personally used to be more open to the idea that geoengineering could have progressive potentials and might be necessary at some point. But the more you study this technology, this is my own experience, the more you realize that the dangers inherent in this technology are absolutely overwhelming. And that the risk with geoengineering is that once it gets underway, it will provide cover for continued business as usual. We argue this extensively. It's very unlikely, the scenario that he depicts in his novel, that you have the deployment of geoengineering coinciding with a rush to smash emissions. He creates, in his novel, this situation by combining geoengineering with global armed struggle in the form of the children of Kali, who at the very same moment begin this ferocious onslaught on fossil capital across the world. I mean, it makes for a very stimulating novel, but it's unlikely to happen in the real world for a lot of reasons. One being that if solar geoengineering works in the initial moment of deployment, in the sense that it actually cuts temperatures, which it promises to do, and relieves some of the worst impacts of global warming, such as heat waves, there will be very likely a sigh of relief and a sense that we've finally found a technological solution to this problem, one that alleviates these impacts and allows us to continue as we are doing now with fossil fuels. That temptation would be absolutely irresistible. Anything, arguing against that is to totally underestimate precisely the inertia that has brought us into this place, the deep structural imperative to maintain business as usual. This imperative will be reinforced if solar geoengineering is as successful as it's promoted to be. And I also think that it's an illusion that someone like the Indian government will be responsible for global geoengineering deployment. There's only one realistic candidate for a global deployer of stratospheric aerosol injection, and that is the United States. Because the United States is the world's single most powerful empire and military apparatus, and it's extremely unlikely that the US in its current form, or any kind of form that's discernible in the near future, would allow anyone else to have this control over the world's climate and weather patterns. because the agent in charge of the deployment of geoengineering will have an absolutely, totally unprecedented power over the planet as a whole. And if you have negative consequences for any kind of zones of interest for the US, then it's absolutely crucial for the US to be able to modulate and adjust the dosages and the injections of stratospheric aerosol. Yeah, so this is not something that we've come up with, but other scholars have argued that the only realistic candidate for deployment is the US, and more specifically the Pentagon, because this is going to be a deeply militarized project. And I don't think we can trust the Pentagon with good intentions when it comes to, I mean, from a left position, that should be impossible.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I want to touch a little bit on, I mean, you brought it up, American politics, the American political system. We're here 2 days after the US election, Donald Trump back at it. In a lot of the kind of climate group chats I'm in, there's a lot of despair is the word I would use about what this election means for the climate. And, Trump's first term, he brought in Rex Tillerson from ExxonMobil. He brought in Scott Pruitt, a sort of major lobbyist to run the EPA, tried to gut it, all of these things. Really bad. At the same time, Joe Biden presided over more oil and gas licensing in his first couple of years than Trump. Kamala spent her entire campaign cheering on fracking. Obama kind of did the same. How should we be thinking about the implications of this election for the climate? And, is there really that much of a difference between the Republicans and Democrats, both in terms of their climate, the policies they enact, but also their relationship, I guess, to fossil capital?
Yeah, so, I mean, despair is not a strange reaction, of course, to this. And it's quite likely that the second Trump presidency will be worse than the first in terms of its aggressive climate denialism and fossil fuel chauvinism, and that there are more comprehensive plans to destroy anything that resembles climate policy in the US and accelerate fossil fuel production even more. One remarkable coincidence, which isn't really, I think, a coincidence, is that we've had 2 countries in the global north in the past months that have first suffered extreme flooding after storms, with a lot of people dead and houses and other types of infrastructure destroyed, and shortly after have had national elections, namely Austria and the US. Spain just had their floods, but they don't have national elections right now. But in both the case of Austria and the United States, the devastating disasters were followed by elections where the climate denialist far right won. In Florida, recently battered by hurricanes on a significant and lethal scale, Trump performed much better now than he did in the last election, and the Republicans are soaring, and they're doubling down on their climate denialism. So we really have to question the idea that people will wake up to the reality of the climate crisis when these disasters strike. It seems to be rather the other way around in parts of the global north, at least. And I also think, this is something that you and I, Adrian, maybe discussed at one point, this idea that climate denialism is a thing of the past and that we've moved beyond this into a capitalist class recognizing the reality of climate breakdown and trying to deal with it through some kind of green capitalism and things like that. I think it has been too early and remains too early to discount the lifetime, the force of far-right climate denialism. It doesn't seem to have any kind of expiry date. It just seems to continue and perhaps even grow the deeper into the crisis we are. Now, one of the parts of the question that you asked now is, how does this relate to the sort of green capitalism, liberal presidents like Biden, what we called capitalist climate governance in the book White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism, which I wrote together with the Zetkin Collective, which was largely an attempt to understand the first Trump presidency, but to put it in the context of a general global surge of the far right in Europe and in Brazil as well. And that book, unfortunately, now feels very topical and relevant because it's precisely about the kind of politics that now again won the American elections. So there we ask, okay, what is the relation between capitalist climate governance and climate denialism in its more aggressive and explicit forms? And you can perhaps group the notions of overshoot and carbon dioxide removal and all these things in the space of capitalist climate governance. And this sort of governance is an attempt to combine a nominal recognition of the reality of the climate crisis with a refusal to confront business as usual. And to imagine that markets and capital accumulation can provide the solution to this problem. This is the sort of politics represented by someone like Obama or Biden. And I think, and this is something that maybe Wim and I try to argue in the Overshoot book as well, that this in itself represents a sort of break with reality. And the reality is such that if we're going to respect limits to global warming, we have to shut down fossil fuel production virtually in its entirety and as fast as physically possible. This is the reality. But capitalist climate governance cannot really accept that reality and launch that type of confrontation. So it has to depart from reality and instead come up with solutions that are essentially fictional, such as there will be some kind of technologies towards the end of this century that will bail us out and draw down the excess CO2 that we cannot avoid putting out into the atmosphere. This very often borders on the magical and the irreal. And Wim and I argue in the second book that a lot of the carbon dioxide removal technologies really have the status of magic because these technologies do not exist in reality for the most part. And were they to exist in reality, they, on a very large scale, they would be fantastically destructive to various kinds of ecosystems. So probably they won't ever exist on the scale imagined. So there is something fundamentally imaginary about these technologies. And to bank on them marks a break with reality, a kind of detachment from the material world, which has been ongoing in climate politics for some time, precisely because if you accept the real constraints of the material reality of climate breakdown, you are pushed towards a confrontation with class interests that no one in this sphere is prepared to take on. So the point here, the point that I'm trying to make is that Trump, to every sane person, and his kind of climate denial is a departure from reality. It's a disassociation from the reality of climate breakdown. It was even this quite illustrative case during his campaign when he was giving had a rally in Arizona, and it was so extremely hot that people in the crowd were fainting and had to be brought to hospital. But Trump was on stage and said, "It's fine here. I don't feel the heat. I'm doing well." And he just kept on talking about how much oil he's going to drill. That is, that's how the denial of reality works in its most egregious form, and it's quite easy to see. But the denial that exists in the realm of capitalist climate governance is different by matters of degree, not by kind. It's also a kind of detachment from reality. So what Biden has been doing over the past 4 years, well, just as you said, accelerating oil and gas production, and the U.S. even before Trump takes power now, is producing more oil and gas than any country has ever done in history, and the curves are just going upwards. This is, letting the material forces of business as usual just barrel on towards the abyss. And then you combine this with token investment in renewable energy and carbon dioxide removal technologies such as direct air capture and things like this. All of this is an abdication and a sort of, escape or detachment from the reality of climate breakdown and what needs to be done. So these are communicating vessels. These are not opposites. We shouldn't think of capitalist climate governance or green capitalism or whatever you want to call it and the climate denialist pole of Trump as antithesis, but rather as two sides of the same coin. And there is a kind of a movement between these as various types of denial, and different political conjunctures and specific factors determine which one is ruling for what years in the US or elsewhere. But they really represent, there are two symptoms of the same refusal to recognize the reality of climate breakdown as it is experienced almost on a daily basis, as it is perceived by people who consume the news, and as it is being mapped by climate scientists. And to instead let the investments in fossil fuel continue. These investments, of course, they exist in a kind of a separate universe. So when the big fossil fuel companies keep pouring their enormous profits into fossil fuel production, this has no relation to what we know about climate suffering as it looks like now and as it will look like in the future. And it's these material forces that to which Trump and Biden and virtually every state in the world, with the exception perhaps of Colombia, quite an important exception in my view, are beholden. It's to these material forces that they are loyal.
I'm curious to know how long you think that can last, the kind of overt denialism that admittedly, has had longer legs than many of us, myself included, thought. Went quiet for a little bit, but it's really back in full force. Not least because I think, some of the entities that are most pushing for solutions like carbon removal technologies are, the fossil fuel companies themselves. And so if you're simultaneously kind of pouring energy into outright denial of climate crisis while also kind of pushing for the adoption and rollout of these technologies, it kind of feels like those two things are in conflict and at some point will sort of force a rupture. And I wonder, I'm thinking a little bit about the kind of what people call the sort of eco-fascist current as the kind of next instantiation of what this might look like. So a kind of hard borders, kind of pull up the drawbridge type politics. So curious where you see, I guess, denialism going. Is that the kind of pathway that it's walking down?
I sort of think that denialism can go on forever, and that it can just spiral on and reinvest in itself and become more aggressive and more distant from reality without any. There are no internal mechanisms within climate denial to stop it at a certain point. And I don't think there is a moment when climate denialists are forced to open their eyes and recognize that they have been wrong. This is to attribute to them in particular and to bourgeois civilization in general a rationality that it doesn't exist there. But yeah, so eco-fascism, this is one of the speculations that we had in White Skin Black Fuel, that the far right is probably going to take this turn towards saying that yes, climate change exists and it's a real problem, and our solution to it is the fortified white nation. And the case that seemed to point to such a turn was France. Mm-hmm. But recent trends in France suggest that the far right has actually toned down that kind of green nationalism and reverted again largely to default climate denial in its more classical forms. So there was a moment that coincided with the general wave of climate mobilization in the world, 2018, 19, 20, when the far right experimented around the world with ecofascism and green nationalism and made some kind of spectacular actions, including the massacre in Christchurch and stuff like that. But that cycle seems now to have come to an end, and what we're seeing is instead parties like the FPÖ or the Sweden Democrats in my own country, Sweden, or Donald Trump, representing the by far the most politically successful project on the far right, which still is default denial. Now, that said, I think there comes a point when someone like Donald Trump will have to deal with the reality of global warming, because even he will at some point presumably feel too hot. Or who knows if Mar-a-Lagos get attacked by a hurricane the next time.
Inundated.
Yes, or
sad.
Yeah, or he loses some other property of some kind. Or, the class or the class fractions that he represents realizes that, shit, it's too hot in here and we have to do something about it. Now, that moment will, I think, be very conducive to Trump's or someone of his kind conversion to geoengineering. Because someone like Donald Trump can say, it's too hot on this planet and we need to cut temperatures, and we have a technology here for doing it, which is a great technology. And you can do geoengineering without even recognizing that global warming is due to fossil fuel combustion. You can just say that its temperatures have risen. I have no idea why. The climate always changes. Yeah. Right now it's too hot. Yeah. But we have a technology for dealing with this. So, and this is something that even someone like David Keith, who is like the chief ideologist of solar geoengineering, worried about during the first Trump presidency, that Trump will just announce one day on Twitter that, okay, I'm going for geoengineering. That didn't happen during the first presidency. Who knows if it's going to happen now during the second? But the reason that someone like David Keith, who is like the great, evangelist of geoengineering, fears that is that he understands that if Donald Trump deploys geoengineering, there's no way on earth that that is going to be combined with emissions cuts. Then Donald Trump will do geoengineering to disconnect business as usual from temperature increases. So you can have business as usual without the temperature increases. This is what would be attractive to someone like him with this technology. And Keith and everyone else who studied geoengineering knows that if you have geoengineering, so you have this sun shield around the earth with sulfate aerosols, and you keep emitting CO2, this is a recipe for absolute catastrophe. For a number of different reasons, including that you will then have to increase the doses of sulfate aerosols to compensate for the radiative forcing of the CO2 in the atmosphere, and this will cause all the potential negative side effects of geoengineering to multiply and spiral, and they will get worse. And the risk will then become that at a certain point you have a termination of the geoengineering that you've had for decades or whatever it is, and then you have the termination shock when the climatic effects of all this CO2 are realized, and you get a spike in warming with maybe 4 or 5 degrees per decade, and that's the end of it. So the extremely disturbing thing with this scenario of someone like Donald Trump possibly converting to geoengineering is precisely that would be a guarantee that you will have a combination of geoengineering and business as usual.
We're up against a lot there. And I think, one of the things that you articulate so well in Overshoot is just the scale of embedded kind of capital that we're up against, kind of trillions of dollars worth of fossil fuel assets themselves kind of owned and distributed throughout global financial markets, to which, many people are exposed and therefore invested. And I guess my last question for you is just about, what the hell do we do? You have just a little known book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Is that where we're at? Is that kind of the strategy going forward? What would you say is the necessary task at this point? Is it just that we need to destroy that value, and that's kind of the overarching goal for all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we should be honest and recognize that the situation for the climate movement in the global north is very different now compared to when I wrote How to Blow Up a Pipeline. In Europe and the United States, with the only exception of France, the climate movement currently is, I would say, in a dismal condition. What remains of it is disoriented. It's battered by repression. It has lost the popular support that existed in 2018 and 19. There was a moment between, let's say, the waning of the pandemic and maybe late 2022 or something like that, when the fragments of the climate movement surviving the outbreak of the pandemic started experimenting with more militant tactics, and you had a diversification of the tactical repertoire of the movement, and you saw groups doing sabotage in various forms. But that came to an end. I'm not sure I need to go into the details here, but largely because of external shocks, geopolitical events, the invasion in Ukraine, and now the genocide in Gaza, which is absorbing a lot of the limited supply of activist energy in the global north for totally legitimate reasons. Yeah. But with the exception of France, the climate movement is very weak right now. So blowing up pipelines, I'm still firmly committed to the idea that we need to escalate the struggle, but it seems today to be further away than what it did in, let's say, 2019, 2021, 22. If I were to point to an alternative right now or something promising, it wouldn't be the climate movement as we used to know it in 1819. It would be to one government in this world, namely the government of Colombia. I have a love affair at a distance with this government. It's easy to have love affairs at a distance because it always looks better at a distance than what it looks in close up. But I'm aware of the shortcomings and the problems of the project that the government in Colombia is having. But I think we should recognize how unique that government is in the world today. Colombia is the third largest fossil fuel producer in Latin America after Brazil and Venezuela. It has been utterly dependent on the production and export of fossil fuels, accounting for about a half or sometimes more of its exports. And as you know, Colombia is now, since 2022, governed for the first time by a left-wing government, for the first time in its history, and it has a left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, and a very important environmental minister of the environment, Susana Mohammed. And what they are doing is that they are trying to actually shut down fossil fuel production in their own country. This is unique. There is no other significant fossil fuel producer on Earth that has said anything like this. So, for instance, when Petro campaigned in 2022, he promised to halt all exploration on new fossil fuels. And since he came into power, not a single new exploration deal has been signed in that country. This means that the oil and gas industry is on track to disappearance in that country, because if you don't renew your supplies after you've depleted your oil and gas fields by exploring and finding more fields, then you have nothing to do. So currently the estimate is that oil and gas production in Colombia will be finished anywhere between 7 and 15 years from now, if this position holds. And oil and gas production in Colombia is now plummeting, which is unique. Including in Latin America, where you have Venezuela, Brazil, Guyana, Mexico, more or less ruled by left-wing governments, all forging ahead with oil and gas production. So this is a unique case. And it's incredibly interesting because what they're also saying is that they're going to stop their production and export of fossil fuels and instead massively ramp up their production and export of solar and wind, the potentials for which are, of course, enormous in a country such as Colombia. And Susana Mohammed and Gustavo Petro, they're talking about a trans-American grid through which they can export this electricity based on the flow or on renewables. And I could go further into it. I mean, it's an incredibly fascinating example because it represents, in a way, the model of what we on the climate left would like to see, namely government based on a democratic mandate from a national election. So winning a national election, but this was, of course, largely based on the popular uprising that happened in Colombia in 2019, a groundswell of social unrest that included a lot of militant confrontation with police forces, then converted into an electoral victory. And now this government is trying to implement a real transitional program away from fossil fuels. Then it, of course, encounters a lot of trouble, which this sort of political project is bound to do. So there is deep hostility from investors now against Colombia. And there's this perception from fossil fuel producers, large companies such as Occidental Petroleum, which have been snubbed by the Colombian government and the state-owned oil company. So this company, at the instructions of the government, has turned down potentially extremely lucrative deals with Occidental Petroleum and other oil companies in the US. And they're furious, and they hate Gustavo Petro for being anti-oil, anti-gas, anti-coal, anti-United States, and so on. So, yeah, I have a comrade who says that every morning I wake up and Petro is still alive is a surprise, because he represents a very particular kind of threat against fossil capital. And there are, of course, other problems. Colombia has a sort of a deep state that is fundamentally at one with the bourgeoisie in that country that, of course, tries to obstruct Petro, and there is an opposition against him and his government that has grown in recent months, and so on and so forth. So there are all these problems. But this is precisely why we need to follow this project, because it represents, at this moment in time, the most interesting case of a fossil fuel producing country where what needs to happen actually is attempted, right? And what we need to do is precisely drawing an actual limit to fossil fuel production and saying, okay, within 10 years, all of it's going to be done. We're going to be over. We're going to be over with it. We're going to have fossil fuel production abolished. This is not technically impossible or in any way, beyond the realm of feasibility. It's just a matter of political balance of forces, and this is what we're seeing in Colombia right now.
I think that's actually the perfect place to leave it. I've lots more I'd love to ask, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.